Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on history of English literature, and so far we have conducted 22 lectures under this series, and all the lectures are uploaded for you on YouTube. Dear friends, taking the series forward, today we would be talking on the post-war poets. In the first half we would be discussing on images as a sideshow, whereas in the second session we would be discussing on the poets who also fought. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is a renowned academician, I would say. He is a person who always believes in giving maximum knowledge he has attained throughout his life. So dear friends, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, under whose able guidance we would be discussing on the post-war poets in detail. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Well, today we shall be discussing the post-war poets. To begin with, imagism as a sideshow. Let me go back a little. Modernism, as I said in the very beginning, was no movement by itself. It was a set of movements, smaller movements, little movements, plenty of them. Imagism was one, surrealism was another, and cubism still another, vorticism still another, so on and so forth. So there were several smaller movements, all put together are called modernist movements. And this went on for almost half a century, until the end of World War II, 1945. So during this period, particularly between the two world wars, World War I, which began 1914, ended 1918. Second began 1939, ended 1945. So this period between the wars is particularly called the modernist period. And as I explained, modernism was a reaction against the 19th century in particular and against the Renaissance in general. Renaissance had started in the 14th century and continued until the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th, beginning of post-World War II period. So modernism was a reaction to all this. Romanticism, which dominated the 19th century, including the later part called Victorianism. The poetry there and literature in general was emotional. It was sentimental, soft, and this modernism was a reaction against that. That is why Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and then T.E. Hume, they reacted very strongly against it and said poetry must be hard, not soft. And no romanticism, no sentimentalism, no emotionalism, because we are living in hard times. World War I had changed the world. As Willa Cather, one of the American female writers, said, that the world fell apart into two. The world that had been before for 2000 centuries or more, and the world now after World War I. These didn't seem to have anything in common, because now they felt they had been thrown into a world which they had never known, a world which they don't know how to face. So this post World War I period of disenchantment, period of disillusionment, and period of being compelled to have a hard look on life. You can't afford to daydream as the romantics used to do. No daydreaming. You have to keep your eyes open and face the hard facts of life which are compelling, which are before you, which you cannot ignore. So, it is in these conditions that the first important writer who comes on the scene is T.E. Hume, Hulme. T.E. Hume didn't write much poetry. He wrote actually only 4 poems. But then he gave a manifesto of modernism. He gave not only a terminology, but a poetics called imagism, which very fashionably Pound would call das imagists in French, means the imagists. So they called themselves Pound and Company imagists, not poets, that they are creating images, they are putting images together, and that is what poetry is. Not poetry of statement, poetry of images. Poetry means an image. So this was their slogan, and this was their emphasis. So dry, hard poetics, which was dictated by the war. So Harriet Monroe was another, besides T.E. Hume. Harriet Monroe was a female poet who was also editing a journal called Poetry. And these 4 poems of T.E. Hume also appeared in this very journal, Poetry. And in this very journal, Poetry, T.E. Hume and Ezra Pound wrote their prose pieces exposing and explaining what they mean by imagism. So, Das Imagist by Pound also appeared in Harriet Monroe's poetry journal, and she also was one of these imagists, Harriet Monroe. There were some others like F.S. Flint. Then there was another female poet, H.D. Hilda Doolittle, but she was fond of writing H.D. So she is better known as H.D. Still another was Richard Adlington, and then another female, Amy Lowell, then D.H. Lawrence. So imagine, and then John Fletcher, who actually published the manifesto in 1913, again in poetry, in the form of Interview with Pound by Flint. So we had all these poets coming after World War I, not as a group, as I said, not bound by any common program, and yet having very similar views on the subject of poetry, on the subject of age. And T.E. Hume, as I said, gave that first slogan against the 19th century romantic aesthetics. And Harriet Monroe provided a platform. It was her journal, Poetry, where everything happened. In 1912, thus imagists in Harriet Monroe's poetry appeared by T.E. Hume and all other poets that I have mentioned. So it appeared in the form of Interview with Pound by Flint. So if a few things about that interview, because that's very important, and that explains the whole thrust of imagism. What was the whole philosophy of imagism about? The poetics. Beginning with the first phase of modernist poetry, the pioneering work was done by T.E. Hume, who, though he wrote only 4 poems, raised the banner of revolt against the 19th century aesthetics of poetry generated by Romanticism. With his 1909 group of rather obscure poets, Hume discussed in weekly meetings at Soho restaurant, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, for a year or so, a dry and hard, within quotes, dry and hard poetics to suit his times, the difficult times after World War I. Then Pound took over in 1912, made Harriet Monroe's poetry, that journal, an organ for what he called in French des imagists. DES means the imagists, and published the complete poetical works of T.E. Hume. By the way, the complete works only means 4 poems. But then the manifesto that it gave in 1913 of what they mean by these imagists, the poetics of imagism. There are 3 main principles of imagism. 1, direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. It may be subjective, related to the poet himself or herself, or it may be any other impersonal subject, objective. Either way, the narrative must be direct, not indirect, because indirection takes away the impact. In the 19th century, there are indirections. Nothing is being said straight. Second, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation, means no extra superfluous words, which means particularly epithets. Epithets means adjectives and adverbs. Even Hemingway, the American novelist, in prose also they were taught during those years not to use any epithet, no extra word. Use the nouns which relate to the object itself. So straightway describe, narrate the object, and don't go roundabout indirectly into the surrounding area of the subject. Straightway attack the subject itself. Third, as regard rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase. So the emphasis was on the sequence of the musical phrase. So obviously poetry has to have music, but then they would not recommend the observance of the prescribed rules, meters, pentameter, hexameter, octometer, so on and so forth, they would rather go by the musical phrasing of the language. So these were broadly three principles which they followed. And Ezra Pound then further explained it. He said, use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. Then don't use such an expression as dim lands of peace. He was against this kind of romanticizing of expressions, of language, of making it dreamy, wishful thinking. He would say straightway, say what you want to say, the object itself, and nothing extra, nothing. He would say it is wooling, just like you use wool for soft padding. So no padding, no soft wool around the subject. Straightway show what the subject is, and hard as it is. So these were the times when Romanticism was gradually but very definitely being rejected and being replaced, because the times had changed, and changed so suddenly, and changed by one great event at the international level, that was World War I. So suddenly you were thrown into a world which was altogether new. You didn't know where to go. So confusion. It was all disillusion, disenchantment, and the past was erased. You were cut off from the tradition, from history, from past, and suddenly you are in a nowhere land and you don't know where to go. So it was this kind of situation. Sorry. That is why they are insisting upon hardness and against abstractions, insisting upon the concreteness, solidity of the subject itself. So Pound would say, go in fear of abstractions. Do not use abstractions, because then you get lost into a world which is away from the real, away from the solid, objective, real world before you, which you can see, which you can feel. And then don't imagine that the art of poetry is any simpler than the art of music, or that you can please the expert before you have spent at least so much and so forth, which means Pound is only emphasizing the importance of hard work. That poetry is not something that you sit down and spontaneously, whatever comes to your head or heart, you just unload, unpack your heart. Because that is how in 19th century, in romantic aesthetics, poetics, poetry was understood to be. That poetry was nothing but to unpack your heart. Whatever you feel, sincerely, you just render that feeling, narrate your emotion. But now they say, no, you don't have to do that. It is not daydreaming. You have to face the world and describe the world as it is. And it's an ugly world, it's a difficult world, it's a hard world, it is not a world of daydreaming. So that is the difference between Romanticism and modernism. So just the opposite. So they reversed the romantic poetics and pulled it out of the world of daydreaming and pulled it into the world of hard facts. So that is what post-war world is, and that is where the emphasis of imagism comes. And as I said, imagism just was one of those very many movements, little movements. And we will be talking about later surrealism, still another. Then Pound himself, cubism, where like cubes you have modern art where geometrical figures. So you are doing the painting just through the figures of cubes. That was called cubism. Similarly, Pound gave another term, vorticism. He borrowed it from vortex. From vortex, vorticism, science word meaning energy, giving you dynamism. So, vortex. So, he wanted to make poetry just like vorticism. So, these new terminologies came, new emphases came, new ideas came, and all of them put together went against the 19th century romanticism. So, it was a reversal, and it was a complete break with the past. As World War I had brought about the historical break in the continuity of tradition, history. So, modernism brought about a break between the literary history of the past and now the present. Otherwise, right from ancient times, Plato and Aristotle, and before that, the great poet Homer, Greek poet, 3000 years ago. So, right from Homer onward, in the West, there was a continuity of literary traditions in all the languages put together, not necessarily in English. In fact, English comes very late on the scene. It comes on the scene in the 14th century. Before that, it was the literary scene in Europe dominated by Greek and Latin, later French, then German. These were the languages. Greek first, then Latin, then German, then French, and finally English. So that is how it moved from one to another, giving dominance to different languages as I mentioned in the order. In that very order, beginning with the Greek, Latin, French, German, French, and then English. That was the order. In that order, the dominance came. And once dominance came to English, now it became stronger and stronger. Today, it's a world language, it's a global language. Everybody speaks, even Chinese who hated English at one time. But now the entire nation busy learning English. So it has become so important now, you can't do without it. No business, no education, no communication, everything now relies upon English largely. So that is the significance, the importance of English. And all this began during the modernist period after World War I. And the main figures, as I mentioned, were Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, followed by W.H. Auden and his group of poets, but in between several more, and most important among them was Harriet Monroe, who edited a journal called Poetry, and that became an organ for propagating, for promoting, for making public the new ideas of modernist movement, modernism. So, Harriet Monroe that way made a great contribution. T.E. Hume, as I said, was the first one who raised the slogan, who took up the flag and gave a sort of march towards modernism. Just wrote 4 poems, as I said, but his historical role is very significant and important because he initiated the movement. And one of the earliest movements in the series called modernism was imagism. And imagism, as I read out, relied upon 3 broad emphases. And these 3 emphases became the guiding principles for all of the poets of the time. As I mentioned, these half a dozen poets, beginning with Pound, Eliot, Hume, Flint, and Harriet Monroe, Amy Lowell, so on and so forth. So, there were a bunch of poets all working in their own areas and working individually, not really collectively, not as a group, but then their ideas are similar. And when you look into them, they look like a group. But as I said, they were not a group. Their ideas were similar. And that's what brings them together under the umbrella of modernism. And this was for the first time that a set of movements separately emerging, springing up through individual efforts, but then making current similar ideas, similar notions, similar emphases, and all put together combining into a new kind of poetics which we call modernism. So, imagism had a great role to play in this movement. Thank you. Well, in this lecture we shall be talking about the post-war poets. post-war means the same post First World War. The poets who came out of this war, from this war, after this war, and they formed a new group altogether. Gradually it became a group, but as I said, to begin with, they were not a group. Individually they cropped up, but then their ideas being similar, their attack on romanticism being similar, that made them a sort of group. They were not, of course, like Wordsworth and Coleridge or Shelley and Keats and Byron. That was a definite group of the Romantic. Here it was not that sort of group. Here they were individuals. But then, because they were writing in the same period following the war, and they were writing under the same conditions, obviously they had borrowed the same mindset. They were conditioned by the same time and age and temper, and that temper gets reflected in their writings. So, who were these post-war poets? We call them post-war poets. Post-war means post First World War. Then they will come second, we will have to use different terminology. But then to mention a few of them, one of them was Siegfried Sassoon, a little difficult name, Siegfried, 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 is one word, Siegfried. Sassoon, Sassoon, Sassoon. So this was one of the poets of the post-war period, an important one, born in 1886 and lived up to 1967. He did write in traditional diction and meters, but then in hard realistic mode which replaced the romantic, and gruesome and shocking imagery he used. Gruesome and shocking imagery. So these were some of the prominent features of the poetry of Sassoon, and he gave a lead among these post-war poets. He, in a way, was leading these other poets. Let me read out something to give you an idea what exactly was this like. Here it is, 274. Yeah, here it is. There is a poem called They, They, a poem called They. From this poem, I read out a few lines. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they will have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We are none of us the same, the boys reply, for George lost both his legs, and Bill is stone blind. Poor Jim is shot through the lungs and like to die. And Bert has gone syphilitic. You will not find a chap who has served that hasn't found some changes. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. You see how satire works. It is a satirical poetry. But then they are using the traditional figure of the bishop, what the bishop said. So in a way, not directly questioning the bishop, not directly challenging the bishop, not discarding the bishop, not ridiculing. In a way, the whole point of the poem is ridiculing the traditional figure of the bishop. That the bishop will speak the same old thing which he repeats every day in the church. But then this new generation, the new boys who have fought in the war, they cannot accept what the bishop says, because to them it is all bunkum, it is all nonsense. It doesn't address the reality which they have experienced. And he mentions how different boys, suffered differently in the war. Somebody lost his leg, someone lost his hands, somebody was wounded in the chest, so on and so forth. And somebody got syphilis, somebody got, other diseases. That was the result of the war. But then the bishop is blessedly unaware of all this, because he has not seen the war. He has not suffered. He has not gone through that, disenchanting experience. But they have. These young boys, the new generation, they have fought and they have suffered. So that is why their outlook and their perspective, their poetry has to be different. And it is shockingly different. It is eye-opening. It opens your eyes to a new world altogether. Where are you living? Are you daydreaming? The world has changed. The World War has changed the world. And the world in which we are living today is very different from what it had been for centuries. So that is what the new poets are trying to impress upon their readers. That look here, we cannot continue with the tradition. We cannot continue with the history. So we have to now change and change drastically. Only then can we survive in a changed world. You can't survive with the old weapons. The old equipment is not good enough to keep you going into the new era, into the new conditions. So you will have to change drastically and change your perspective, change your outlook, and forget all what this bishop or anyone else has been telling you. So it is an angry mood of the post-war poets. and they are rightly angry because they have suffered the war. They have fought there, they have lost their lives, they have lost their limbs. So obviously they are the angry young men, and it is the poetry, the writing of the angry young men. So these poems are worth reading. So Sassoon was one of them. Another was Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen became very popular. He was born 1893 and died in 1919. He died in the war itself. He died fighting. And before he died, of course, during the war years, he had scribbled some poems, and that poetry survives. And as I read out from the poem They, it is his poem, Wilfred Owen's poem They, and that quietly tells the difference between the traditional outlook of the bishop and the new perspective of this generation, which Hemingway would call, no, Gertrude Stein had said, the lost generation. So this generation was lost. They didn't know where to go, totally confused by the war. So Isaac Rosenberg himself died fighting. Then Wilfred Owen, he wrote some of these poems. Greater Love was one, Strange Meeting was another, and Anthem for Doomed Youth, still another. The very title suggests what kind of poetry it is, and it's a poetry which has come out of the hard experience of war. No such poetry was written before, because poetry earlier was a sort of pastime. When you have free time, when you have leisure, when you want to just sit and quietly feel and daydream, then you write poetry. It is not that kind of poetry. It's poetry that has come out of the most disenchanting, difficult experience of fighting. They have fought in the war, they have suffered, they have lost their lives, and it is their writing, their poetry. Obviously, it has to be different. So Wilfred Owen himself died. Then Isaac Rosenberg, he also died in 1918, because the war continued between the years 1914 and 1919, these 5 years. And during this war period of 5 years, so many poets died, as Ezra Pound describes in one of his poems, how they fought and how they died. Very moving poem by Ezra Pound. So Rosenberg wrote some of these poems. Dead Man's Dump. Look at the title itself. Dead Man's Dump. Secondly, Break of Day in the Trenches. The trenches in the war. And then another, Returning we hear the larks. Returning from the war, we hear the larks. So Rosenberg was another poet who also died fighting. So these young boys, young poets, promising ones, lost their lives, and for whom? Ezra Pound was very angry. Now, who are we losing these lives? Precious lives of young people, and he will curse the Western civilization, which he compares with the old bitch gone in the teeth. He says angrily that Western civilization is like the old bitch gone in the teeth. It has grown dead and decadent, old. It is better discarded. So it was this kind of contempt which was evoked because they thought this World War I was a result of the Western civilization, which had been there for 2000 years there, Christian civilization. So they are cursing that it is the result of following that stupid civilization that we have come to this pass. So this anger, this gets reflected in their poems. As I read out Sassoon's They, then Wilfred Owen's The Sentry. He has a poem called The Sentry. They was by Sassoon, and The Sentry is by Wilfred Owen. Let me read out a few lines from the Owen's poem, The Sentry. The lines are: bent double like old beggars under sacks. Bent double like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludges. See how step by step the poetry moves, and each step very firmly and very significantly suggesting the kind of life they had in the war. Knock-kneed, you see, knees kicking each other under the burden. Knock-kneed and coughing like hags means old women prostitutes. We cursed through sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the boots of a tired, outstripped 5 nines that dropped behind. So that is how one by one the soldiers marching towards their target goal, losing their lives on the way. As they are marching, they are being killed by the enemy, bullets and so on. So he is describing that scene. It was this kind of poetry which was not before. Compare and contrast it with the 19th century poetry, which is very different, very soft, very pleasing, very soothing, and it will breed daydreaming. But here, disenchanting, eye opener. You can't afford to wink your eyes, because here is the pain and suffering of those who went through the war. And who were these? The young boys. And they are cursing their own civilization, their old people who brought them to this pass, and they have to suffer for their mistakes. So Pound's dicta worked those days, as I said, and his dicta was, because he, like Hitler, you see, ruled the Western literary world between the wars, between the two world wars, beginning 90s, 30s, 20s, 30s, and part of 40s, because World War began 1939. So between 1914 and 1939, these 3 decades, they were dominated by, you see, Ezra Pound. And he was a great dictator, very self-opinionated, self-confident, and he wouldn't think anyone is like him. Therefore, he would straightway dictate things even to the older poets. Poets like W.B. Yeats, much older than Pound. Even he, when he came to know that Pound had come to England for some time, so he rushed to London and carried his poems with him and showed his poems to Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound, self-opinionated as he was, he will quickly browse through and say, oh, no, this stuff, this will not do. It is too soft for our times. So keep it away. I am not interested in this kind of poetry. Because Yeats in a way was old-timer. So Pound was very much like Hitler. In the world of literature, he had the same stature and the same voice, very commanding voice, and whatever he said was accepted as the final word, and everybody followed it. So this is what he said. Number 1, that poetry should be at least as well written as prose. Imagine, earlier people used to think that poetry and prose are very different. And prose is prosaic, dull, whereas poetry is charming, poetry is intoxicating. So these were the broad ideas about prose and poetry. But he is reversing. He is giving more importance to prose. And he says poetry should be at least as well written as prose. So, virtues of prose, he is emphasizing as against the virtues of poetry. Because here poetry means the 19th century kind of poetry, romantic poetry, which they want to discard. That is why Pound emphasizes prose, that poetry should be at least as well written as prose. So that is how it goes. Just a few lines from Rosenberg's Dead Man's Dump. Look how the poem goes. None saw their spirits shadow shake the grass, or stood beside for the half-used life to pass out of those doomed nostrils and the doomed mouth, when the swift iron burning bee, look how he describes bullet, when the swift iron burning bee drained the wild honey of their youth. So how they were killed in the war by the bullets. So in a way, he is inviting pity very strongly here, although Pound had emphasized the non-sentimental, unsentimental kind of poetry, hard one. But when you come to writing, you can't really stick to these dicta. Ultimately, whatever you feel, that comes out. And in a difficult situation where people, your own colleagues, your fellow see young boys are losing their lives, falling left and right dead. How can you not be moved by the scene, by the situation? So that is what he is describing in these lines. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for explaining us in detail the post-war poets, I would say, and here we try to understand imagism as a sideshow as well as the poets who also fought. Dear friends, we believe that you might have liked today's lecture, and as we always keep posting your feedback, and we have received one of the feedbacks from the student, an MA English student, Karun Malhotra. He has appreciated your lectures, and he has said your previous lecture on modernism was quite appreciable, where you explained the images criticized romantics as against the modernists. So he has appreciated the lecture, as well as with regards to imagism, you quoted there that Hume and his principle that everyone should be direct in writing poetry, and pertaining to this he has asked a question that do you think that imagism attack that concept of allegory?
Well, not quite, because symbolism, allegory, imagism, they are related. They can't be separated into tight compartments. They are very similar, because ultimately all of these depend upon metaphor, simile, comparison, without which you can't really communicate. Sometimes what you want to say is something very abstract, something that you feel but you don't see. So you want to make it something visible to the reader, so that the reader can easily comprehend what you want to say. Therefore, you will have to use some comparison, that this thing looks like that thing. So through these comparisons, through metaphors, through similes, through symbols, you communicate your idea, your feeling. So allegory, imagism, surrealism, all these are related phenomena. They are not different from each other. They are very much similar to each other.
I believe that Karun might have got answer of his question, and dear friends, we believe that your feedback is very important for us. Please keep asking your questions, and as we always say that we will try to give answers of your question when the experts visit our studio. So if you have any queries pertaining to the series History of English Literature, so keep asking us question through info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again tomorrow and would be carrying the series forward. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.